the Conservatives had used forecasts for future spending, which included lots of cuts, which nobody thought was realistic, cuts in the NHS and education and so on. And everybody knew that Labour, when it got in, wouldn't be making those cuts and would therefore be likely to have to make different kinds of choices. And the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, is softening us all up for those choices that she's going to make.
Now, The Times reports today that the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, is expected to halt the NHS hospital building programme as part of a string of cutbacks to fill a £20 billion black hole in the government's finances. In a statement to Parliament on Monday, she's due to set out details of a Treasury audit of every government department, setting out unfunded costs and areas where cuts and efficiencies could be made. And she'll blame the Conservatives for what she'll describe as the dire state of the public finances. Well, Michael Jacobs is Professor of Political Economy at Sheffield. He's a former Special Advisor to Prime Minister Gordon Brown. Good afternoon to you, Michael.
Good afternoon, Carol.
What do you make of these reports of a £20 billion black hole? Is that just a new figure on a situation that was looming even before the election?
Yes, we knew before the election that the public finances were not in a very good state. The Conservatives had used forecasts for future spending, which included lots of cuts, which nobody thought was realistic, cuts in the NHS and education and so on. And everybody knew that Labour, when it got in, wouldn't be making those cuts and would therefore be likely to have to make different kinds of choices. And the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, is softening us all up for those choices that she's going to make. She clearly wants to blame the Conservatives, which is not unfair, given that they've been in power for the last 14 years. She's doing, of course, what George Osborne did in 2010, coming in with the coalition after the election in that year when he blamed the Labour government for overspending. And the Conservatives are going to be blamed this time round for leaving the public accounts in a bad condition. And we know that there isn't enough money to achieve the level of public services that people want, to give the public sector workers pay rises, to improve the NHS, and so on and so on. So yes, the Treasury is looking at the figures, and Chancellor Reeves will tell us on Monday just how bad they are.
Do you think that the Tories have a point when they say that, look, all these figures were there in the OBR forecasts even beforehand? You didn't need to essentially keep quiet about it until you won power and then come out with these warnings?
I don't think the Tories have a leg to stand on. They were proposing tax cuts even when there wasn't enough money to spend on public services. So the Conservatives were also pretending to the British public that things were much better and claiming that they could cut taxes. Labour wasn't doing that, but was using the Conservative figures. And honestly, in an election campaign, it's inevitable that parties will only say what they really want to say. Yes, it was absolutely known because, as I say, we were looking at figures produced by the Office of Budget Responsibility and the government's own forecast, which were unrealistic. So to some extent, it's true that what is going to be announced on Monday is not new, but it's also true that the government has had a chance over the last month since being elected to look at figures that were not available when the last set were published. And so some of what they will have discovered is new to the public, and that's what we'll be hearing about on Monday.
So, given that, do you think it was perhaps a mistake for Labour to be so clear that it was not going to be putting up certainly any of the main rates of taxation, income tax, national insurance, and so on, thus boxing itself in and creating a situation where now they will be stand accused of breaking promises if they do have to put up taxes?
I don't think there is any chance that Rachel Reeves will put up any of the taxes that she promised not to, which, as you say, was the basic and higher rates of income tax and VAT. That was a clear promise, and I think it would be extraordinary if they went back on that. What they're likely to do if they find, as I think we are being prepared for, that there isn't enough money to pay for public services, they will raise some other taxes, ones they didn't promise not to raise. The obvious ones are the ones on people on higher incomes. We've got capital gains tax still charged at a lower rate than income tax. So that's the capital gain that you make between a financial asset or a house or property between what you sell it for and what you bought it for, that gain is taxed at a lower rate than income tax. And every economist would tell you that's not a good idea. So I suspect those rates will be equalized. There are lots of loopholes in inheritance tax. You can put money into agricultural land and then you don't get taxed on it inheritance tax. That will affect a very small number of very rich people. So I think if there are tax rises, and they of course will come in the budget in the autumn, not on Monday, they will be very targeted at people who are wealthier, on higher incomes, and the vast majority of taxpayers will not see any rise in their own taxes.
Do you think we could see an overall increase in inheritance tax, perhaps at the rate you pay it or the threshold where it kicks in?
I think Labour's unlikely to do that unless the situation is even worse than we think. I think it will adjust the various reliefs and allowances in inheritance tax, which effectively exempt certain kinds of investment from inheritance tax. We have to remember inheritance tax is only paid by 4% of estates of people who die. So that's a tiny number of people, and they are all very wealthy by definition, relative to the average. So it's already paid by a very small number of people, but it does have a kind of iconic quality. A lot of people don't like the idea of it, although in many ways it's quite a good idea to tax income that you get when you are the recipient of legacies that you haven't earned, you've just been lucky enough to get. But because it's a bit of a sensitive tax politically, I think Labour won't touch the main rates, but I think it will touch the allowances.
And what about spending cuts? The Times suggesting today we could see the hospital building programme scrapped. We know some hospitals are in a pretty dire state and will be concerned about that. And we've got nearly all our public services crying out for extra cash. The NHS, we know we've had all the warnings about the huge problems there, the need to try and invest in order to encourage staff to work longer hours. We've been hearing about problems in the education system, the prisons overflowing, the justice system with a huge backlog. Are we going to see cutbacks even in those kind of areas where there's a huge clamour for more money?
I was very surprised to see that report today, because, as everybody knows, the NHS needs more money. The kind of spending cuts that were mooted in the Times today were capital cuts. That's cuts in the building program, and there is always the possibility of cutting your capital expenditure, that is on essentially on buildings and equipment, even if you're spending more money on current expenditure, that is largely people. But I think that's even unlikely, because we know that many hospital and NHS buildings are in need of repair, and one of the reasons that we say that the NHS is under such pressure is that the building fabric and the number of hospital beds and so on in some areas isn't enough. So I was surprised at that. I think if there were going to be capital cuts, building cuts, they're more likely to be in the prisons program. If you ask the British public, would you prefer to spend money on building a hospital with some beds for people who are ill, or prisons for people who are being locked up? I think they'd prefer the hospitals. The prisons are overflowing, but only because we have vastly more numbers of people going to prison than we used to do. So it wouldn't surprise me that with James Timpson, the prison reformer, now as the prisons minister, we had a different approach to prisons in which we tried to reduce the prison population, particularly people for whom prison is just a way of them becoming hardened criminals, rather than build new prisons. So if there are going to
Okay.
be any cuts in capital expenditure, I would have thought that's more likely than in the hospital program.
Will be one of the tough choices that we keep hearing the Chancellor talking about. Michael Jacobs, Professor Michael Jacobs, former Special Advisor to Prime Minister Gordon Brown, thanks so much for joining us. Now, stay with us here on Weekend Drive. Coming up, we are going to be getting the latest on that increasingly bitter US presidential race, and we'll find out whether COVID is back.